As the days continued to pass on the ranch, something had shifted between Amelia and Charles. The tension that once hung in the air between them had slowly begun to dissolve, replaced by a sense of understanding, even if unspoken. Amelia had never expected this kind of connection, but now, with each passing day, she felt the weight of her journey and her purpose here more deeply. She had arrived at the ranch as a stranger, full of hope and uncertainty, but now she was beginning to feel that she belonged. It wasn't just the physical work that had changed her, it was something deeper. The land had begun to feel like part of her, and in turn she had started to understand the silent rhythms of the wilderness around her. Each tree, each stone seemed to hold a memory, a story. The wind carried whispers of secrets, and the animals moving through the fields spoke to her in a language she was beginning to understand. One morning, as Amelia was finishing her chores, she noticed Charles standing near the barn, looking out toward the forest. His back was to her, but she could tell something was different. He wasn't just lost in thought. He seemed to be waiting for something, or perhaps for someone. It had been days since they had really spoken about the things that were bothering them, the things that had been left unsaid. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something Charles wasn't telling her, something that hung between them like an unspoken truth. Taking a deep breath, she made her way toward him, her footsteps crunching softly in the dry grass. As she approached, Charles turned, and for the first time in a long while, there was something vulnerable in his gaze. It wasn't just the usual distance. This time his eyes held something else, something that made Amelia's heart beat a little faster. "You're still out here," she said quietly, her voice gentle. "I thought you were going to take a break." "It's been a long day." Charles smiled faintly but didn't speak right away. He seemed to be searching for the right words, the right way to say what was on his mind. Finally, after a long moment, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, looking at her with a sincerity that made Amelia's breath catch. "About you, about us, and about the way I've treated you since you arrived here." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She had known something was coming, but she hadn't expected him to say it so plainly, so honestly. She stood still, waiting for him to continue. "I never really understood what you were going through," Charles went on, his eyes not leaving hers. "I didn't understand what it meant to live with something that made you feel like you didn't belong. I've seen you work, seen how you've handled everything we've thrown at you, but I never truly saw you. Not until now." Amelia felt her throat tighten, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. She had always carried the weight of her past, of feeling rejected and misunderstood. And yet, here was Charles, someone who had once made her feel like an outsider, finally seeing her for who she was. "I never wanted to make you feel that way," Charles continued. "I've been distant, afraid of something I didn't understand. But now I see you, and I don't want to run away from it anymore." Amelia looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions. The past weeks had been a journey for both of them, a journey of understanding. They had both been fighting against something, against their fears, their past, their own uncertainty. But now here they were, standing together in the fading light of the day with everything finally laid bare between them. "I've been trying so hard to fit in here," Amelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I worked hard enough, if I just kept my head down and did everything I was supposed to do, maybe I'd finally feel like I belonged. But I didn't realize that the reason I felt out of place wasn't because of the work or the land. It was because I hadn't allowed myself to really belong. Not to you. Not to anyone." Charles took a step closer, his gaze softening. "You do belong here. I don't know if I can fix everything, but I know that I don't want to lose what we've started. I want to be here with you." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared experiences. For the first time, Amelia felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. She had come to this place looking for a new life, hoping to leave behind the pain of her past. But now, standing beside Charles, she realized that the life she had found here wasn't just a new beginning. It was a true connection, a partnership that was built on understanding and acceptance. As the sun began to dip lower on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the land, Charles reached out and gently took her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. There was no longer any distance between them, no more walls or doubts. The connection they had shared for so long, though quiet and unspoken, had finally come to the surface. "I don't know what the future holds," Amelia said softly, her eyes looking up at him. But I know that I want to find out with you." Charles smiled, the first true smile she had seen from him in a long time. "Then let's see what the future brings," he said. Together. The air between them seemed to shift, charged with the promise of something new. It wasn't just the start of a relationship. It was the beginning of a shared understanding, a union built not just on physical proximity but on emotional and spiritual connection. They were no longer strangers to each other, no longer bound by the past that had once kept them apart. Now they were free to build something new, something stronger. The days that followed were filled with small moments of joy and discovery. Charles and Amelia worked side by side, but there was a new energy in their movements, a shared rhythm that had never been there before. They no longer felt like two people simply existing in the same space. They were partners, supporting each other through the ups and downs of ranch life. Amelia's connection to the land deepened even further. She felt a bond with the wilderness that she couldn't quite explain, something spiritual, almost sacred. It was as if the earth itself had welcomed her home, had accepted her as part of its living, breathing force. She no longer felt like an outsider in this wild, untamed place. The wilderness had become her ally, and the people she had met along the way, especially Charles, had become a part of her story. One evening, as they stood together on the porch, watching the last light of the day fade into darkness, Charles spoke again, his voice full of quiet certainty. "I never thought I'd find something like this," he said, his hand resting on the railing beside hers. "I never thought I could be this happy. But with you, it feels right. It feels like everything is falling into place." Amelia smiled, her heart full of warmth. "I feel the same way," she said softly, "like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And in that moment, surrounded by the vast, endless wilderness, Amelia knew that she had found her place, not just in the land, but in the life she had always dreamed of. With Charles by her side, the future no longer seemed uncertain. It was a future they would build together, one step at a time, in a place that had become her home. The days after Amelia's strange experience in the forest passed slowly. Despite the beauty of the land and the freedom of the wide-open spaces, she found herself lost in thought, unable to fully shake the memory of what had happened. The vision of the kingdom, the connection to something ancient, it all felt so real, so powerful. She tried to push it aside, telling herself that it was just a moment of strange imagination. But deep down she knew it was more than that. She could still feel the power of the forest and the stone under her hand, as though it were a part of her now, something she could never forget. Charles, on the other hand, seemed to keep his distance even more. He had greeted her the day after she had wandered into the woods, asking if she was all right. He seemed concerned, but there was an unfamiliar hesitation in his voice, and Amelia couldn't help but wonder if he had seen something in her that he didn't understand. Something that had changed since that day in the forest. The ranch life continued, its routines almost mechanical. Charles and Amelia worked together in silence, though there was an unspoken understanding between them. There were moments when their gazes would meet, and for a brief second there was something there. Something more than just the cold distance that had existed before. But then just as quickly it would vanish, replaced by the usual quiet reserve. Amelia was beginning to feel the weight of that silence, the growing space between them that no words seemed able to bridge. One morning, Charles asked her to help him with some repairs on the barn. They worked together, fixing broken boards, mending fences, and organizing the tools. It was hard, physical labor, and though Amelia's body was sore by the time they finished, she felt a sense of pride in her work. But still there was no real conversation, no real connection. Charles would give short instructions, nod politely when she did something right, but he never really spoke to her beyond the tasks at hand. Amelia couldn't help but wonder if it was her eyes. She had hoped that when she arrived, Charles would see her differently, see past the strange eyes that had always made her feel like an outsider. But now, weeks into their time together, she realized that he still didn't see her for who she truly was. She was just the woman who worked on the ranch, the one who took orders and did her job without question. She felt invisible in his presence, as if her presence didn't truly matter to him. One evening after a long day of work, Amelia wandered outside to the porch, the cool evening air a welcome relief. The sky was painted with streaks of pink and orange as the sun set behind the hills, and the land around her seemed to breathe with quiet life. She needed some time to herself, time to think, to feel the peace of the place without the pressure of Charles's presence. As she sat down on the steps of the porch, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She didn't look up at first, hoping it was just the wind or perhaps an animal passing by. But then she heard his voice. "You've been quiet lately," Charles said, standing just a few steps away, his hands in his pockets. "I noticed you haven't been yourself." Amelia felt a slight pang in her chest. It was the first time he had truly spoken to her. Not about work or chores, but about her. She looked up at him, her heart suddenly racing. "I've just been thinking," she replied, her voice soft. "I've had a lot on my mind." Charles didn't say anything for a moment. He stood there looking out at the horizon, as though lost in thought himself. Amelia tried to read his expression, but his face was unreadable as it had always been. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he was wondering why she had seemed so distant lately or if he even cared to know. "About what?" Charles finally asked, his voice quiet. It wasn't demanding, but there was something in his tone that suggested he truly wanted to know. Amelia hesitated. She wasn't sure how much she could share. She had never been good at opening up, especially to someone who seemed to barely understand her, but something in his voice, something in the way he looked at her made her want to try. "About everything," she said, looking out at the hills. "About the land. About why I'm here. About you." She almost whispered the last part, unsure if she should say it aloud. It was the truth, though. She had been wondering about Charles, wondering why he seemed so distant, why he hadn't made any real effort to connect with her. Charles didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked closer and sat down beside her, the creaking of the porch beneath his weight the only sound between them. Amelia wasn't sure why he sat, but she was grateful for the company. "You're not the only one who's been thinking," he said finally, his voice low, almost as if he was talking to himself. "I've been thinking about you too, about why you came here. I don't really know how to handle this. You're different from anyone I've ever known, and I'm not sure I understand it. You're not what I expected." Amelia turned her head to look at him, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't sure how to respond. The words seemed to hang in the air, full of meaning but without clarity. What did he mean by different? Was it her eyes again? Was he talking about the way she made him feel, or was he just confused by her quiet nature? "I'm not sure what you mean," Amelia said, her voice tentative, her gaze drifting toward the horizon again. She didn't want to push him. She didn't want to seem too eager for answers, especially when she wasn't sure what the answers would be. Charles sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's your eyes," he said bluntly, as though he had been holding that thought in for far too long. "They make me uneasy, but I can't figure out why. I feel like I'm being drawn in, but I don't know if I should be. I don't know if I should let myself feel this way, but I see something in you. Something that calls to me. Something deep inside." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes, again her eyes. They had always been the thing that set her apart, that made people hesitate. And now they were the very thing that seemed to intrigue Charles. She had always felt like an outsider because of her eyes, but now, here he was, admitting that it was those very eyes that drew him in. It was confusing. It was overwhelming. "I never wanted to make anyone feel uneasy," Amelia said softly, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to be accepted, for who I am." Charles turned to her then, his eyes softening, his expression almost unreadable. "I don't know if I understand everything about you," he said, his voice gentler now, "but I'm trying. I don't want to be the one who makes you feel like you don't belong. You belong here. I don't know if that means anything, but it's the truth." Amelia felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She hadn't expected this kind of honesty from Charles. She had thought he would continue to keep his distance, to remain cold and distant. But now there was something different in his eyes. A flicker of understanding perhaps, or even something deeper. She didn't know what it meant. But for the first time since she arrived, she felt a glimmer of hope. "I want to understand you too," she said quietly, her heart racing. "I want to understand everything." They sat in silence for a long time, both lost in their thoughts, yet for the first time there was no awkwardness between them. The air felt charged with something new, something unspoken but real. And though Amelia wasn't sure what the future held, she knew one thing for certain. Something had changed. A new chapter had begun, one where understanding, acceptance, and perhaps even love could blossom. The days passed, and Amelia settled into the rhythm of life on the ranch. It was hard work, but she found that it suited her. Each morning she rose early, helped with the animals, and worked the fields. The labor was constant, and while it was tiring, it gave her a sense of purpose. The physical demands of the land seemed to wash away some of the doubts she had when she first arrived. But despite the busy days, something inside her felt unsettled. The land was beautiful and the air was fresh, but it was also wild and untamed, just like the feelings she was starting to experience. Every time she worked with Charles, the distance between them seemed to grow. He was kind in his own way, but there was a coldness to him, a reserve that made her feel like an outsider. His eyes would sometimes linger on her for a moment too long, but he rarely spoke to her beyond the necessary instructions for work. She began to wonder if it was her eyes, the very thing she had hoped to leave behind when she left her old life, that made him so distant. One morning, after finishing her chores early, Amelia decided to take a walk. She needed to clear her mind, to escape the overwhelming silence of the ranch. She slipped away from the house and made her way toward the woods that bordered the property. The tall trees, their branches stretching toward the sky, seemed to call out to her. The farther she walked, the quieter it became. It was a deep silence, a stillness that felt both calming and intense. She couldn't explain it, but something about the forest made her feel connected to it in a way she had never felt before. She had always loved nature. There was something about the open fields and the wind in her hair that made her feel free, but this was different. This forest was ancient. As she walked deeper into the woods, the trees grew taller, their trunks thick and gnarled. The air was cool, and the forest floor was covered in a thick carpet of moss. It felt as though she were walking into a world that was both timeless and alive. Amelia wandered for what seemed like hours, lost in the beauty of it all. She didn't notice how far she had gone, nor how the landscape had shifted from the open fields to something more wild and untouched. It was only when she stumbled into a clearing that she stopped to take a breath. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, worn smooth by years of weathering. The stone seemed out of place, almost as if it had been there for centuries, watching over the land. Amelia felt drawn to it. Something about the stone called to her, as if it held some sort of secret. She stepped closer, her heart racing. The moment her hand touched the stone, she felt a strange jolt of energy shoot through her. It wasn't painful, but it was powerful. For a moment, she felt as though the world around her had shifted. The trees seemed to grow taller, the air heavier, and the sound of the forest grew louder, as if it were breathing with her. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, but when she opened them again, everything seemed different. The forest was no longer just a forest. It was alive, a living, breathing entity that seemed to pulse with energy. Amelia could feel it deep within her, a connection to something ancient and sacred. She felt the wind move through the trees as though it were a voice, whispering to her, telling her things she didn't understand. The more she focused, the clearer the messages became, like images flashing before her eyes. She saw vast landscapes, towering mountains, and wild rivers. She saw animals moving through the wilderness, each one more majestic than the last. And in the distance she saw a kingdom, one made of stone and nature, where people lived in harmony with the land. She gasped, her heart racing. She didn't know what she had just experienced, but it felt real, as if she had caught a glimpse of something beyond the physical world. Her eyes, the ones that had always made her feel so different, now felt like they were a part of this vision. It was as though the world around her was speaking directly to her, and for the first time in her life, Amelia didn't feel out of place. She felt connected to it all. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, and Amelia was left standing in the clearing, her breath shallow and her hands trembling. She wasn't sure what to make of what had just happened. She had never experienced anything like it before. Could it have been a dream, a hallucination, or was it something more? She stood there for a long while, trying to gather her thoughts. The silence of the forest was soothing, but her mind was racing. What did this vision mean? Why had it happened to her, and why had it felt so familiar? As she stood there, still trying to process what had just occurred, a sound broke through the silence. The soft rustle of leaves, a twig snapping. Amelia turned around quickly, her heart jumping in her chest. Standing in the clearing was Charles. His face was hard to read, but there was something in his eyes, something different from before. He had followed her into the woods, though she hadn't heard him approach. "I didn't mean to startle you," Charles said, his voice quieter than usual. "I saw you walk off and I wanted to make sure you were okay." Amelia tried to steady her breathing, still shaken by the vision. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just needed some air." Charles nodded but didn't move closer. His eyes lingered on her, studying her in a way that made Amelia feel like he could see right through her. She wasn't sure what to say. She didn't want to explain what had just happened, not yet. It was too much to put into words. "Are you sure you're all right?" Charles asked again, his tone softening just a little. Amelia nodded. "Yes, I'm just fine." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Charles stood in the clearing, watching her, while Amelia tried to steady her thoughts. She had to admit, there was something calming about his presence now, something different than before. He wasn't just the man who had hired her, the man who seemed distant and unsure. There was something in his gaze, something that made her feel as though he was beginning to understand her, but she couldn't be sure. She wasn't even sure if she fully understood herself. "I didn't mean to intrude," Charles said finally, breaking the silence. "I'll leave you to your thoughts. But if you ever need anything, I'm here." Amelia didn't know what to say. She simply nodded, watching as he turned and walked back through the trees. Her mind was still reeling from the vision, from the way the world had seemed to open up before her eyes. She wasn't sure what it all meant, but one thing was certain. Something inside her had shifted. The land, the forest, the very earth beneath her feet, it had all called to her. And for the first time in her life, she had felt truly alive. As she stood in the clearing, Amelia realized that this place, this wilderness, was not just a place to work. It was a place that held secrets, ancient ones waiting to be uncovered, and somehow she knew that she was meant to uncover them. She wasn't just here to live out her days quietly. She was here for something greater. She could feel it deep inside her, pulsing like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Amelia stood in the small rustic room, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to steady her breath as she looked around, taking in her new surroundings. The house was simple but cozy. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and the smell of freshly cut timber and earth filled the air. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. But despite the warmth, Amelia felt a chill creeping over her. Charles sat across from her, his dark eyes fixed on her in a way that made her uneasy. She wasn't sure what it was, but there was something about the way he looked at her that felt different from the letters they had exchanged. In the letters, he had been kind, though reserved. He had spoken of his love for the wilderness, the land he had worked for years. His words had painted a picture of a quiet life, of solitude and peace. But now that she was here in his home, things felt uncertain. She didn't know if it was the distance in his eyes or the way he barely spoke to her, but she began to feel a sense of doubt that had been absent during her journey. "So," Charles said after a long silence, his voice breaking the stillness, "you've made the long trip out here and I'm sure you're tired. You must be hungry too." Amelia nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, I'm very tired. Thank you for welcoming me into your home." Charles nodded but didn't respond immediately. He seemed distracted, his gaze flicking to the fire and then back to her, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Amelia shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of her own appearance. Was it her eyes that caused him to look at her this way? Or was it something else? The silence stretched on, and Amelia felt herself shrinking into the chair, unsure of what to say next. She had imagined this moment 100 times during her journey, but now that she was here it felt so different. She had dreamed of a warm welcome, of a man who would accept her for who she was, but now all she could feel was the weight of his gaze, which seemed to look right through her. Finally, Charles stood up. "I'll have my cook prepare something for dinner. You must be starving after your journey. I'll show you to your room and we can talk more tomorrow." Amelia nodded, grateful for the break. "Thank you," she whispered. As she followed him down the narrow hallway toward a small, neat bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Charles had been kind enough to offer her a place to stay, but his behavior seemed distant, as if he were almost hesitant to engage with her. It was as if he were holding something back, something he wasn't ready to share. When they reached her room, Charles pushed open the door, revealing a small but comfortable space. A bed with a soft quilt, a wooden dresser, and a small writing desk filled the room. A single window overlooked the wide, open plains, the last hints of sunlight slipping over the horizon. It was beautiful, peaceful even, but it felt so far from everything Amelia had known. "This will be your room while you're here," Charles said, his voice still steady but without much warmth. "We have plenty of work to do around here, and it'll take some time to get you settled in. But for now, rest. You'll need your strength." Amelia nodded, but she could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Thank you," she said again, unsure of what else to say. As Charles left the room, closing the door softly behind him, Amelia sank onto the bed, her thoughts swirling in her mind. The quietness of the room was overwhelming, and she couldn't help but feel the isolation of the place. She had come here hoping for a new beginning, for a chance to start fresh, but now that she was here, she wasn't so sure. She had imagined a different kind of welcome, a man who would see her as more than just the woman who had arrived with strange eyes. But Charles didn't seem to look at her that way. Instead, he seemed almost uncomfortable with her presence. The day dragged on slowly. Dinner was served by the cook, an elderly woman who smiled kindly at Amelia but didn't say much. Amelia ate in silence, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. Afterward, she retreated to her room, exhausted but unable to sleep. She couldn't stop thinking about Charles and the way he had looked at her, as if he were trying to figure her out. Her eyes, those cat eyes, had always made people uneasy, but she had hoped that this time would be different. The next morning, Amelia woke early. She had a strange feeling in her stomach, a mixture of hope and anxiety. Charles had told her the day before that there was work to be done around the ranch, and she was eager to get started. She wanted to prove that she could be useful, that she wasn't just someone to be looked at with doubt or uncertainty. After a quick breakfast, she found Charles outside tending to the horses. He greeted her with a curt nod but didn't say much more. Amelia stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should she offer to help with the horses? Should she ask about the work he had mentioned? She didn't want to come across as too eager, but she also didn't want to be ignored. Finally, she spoke. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Charles looked up at her, his eyes momentarily softening. "You can help clean the stables," he said gruffly, his tone not unkind but distant. "We've got some work to do there. After that, I'll show you around the ranch." Amelia nodded and followed him to the stables, where the smell of hay and animals greeted her. She had never worked with animals before, but she wasn't afraid of hard work. She took a deep breath, ready to dive in. As she worked alongside Charles, the silence between them seemed to grow. He didn't speak much, only giving short instructions on what to do next. Amelia did her best to keep busy, moving quickly and efficiently. She didn't want him to think she was slow or lazy. She needed to prove herself, but every time she looked up, Charles's eyes were on her, studying her, as if trying to make sense of something that he couldn't quite understand. The hours passed slowly. By the time they finished, Amelia's hands were sore and her back ached, but she felt a sense of accomplishment. She had worked hard, and though Charles had barely spoken to her, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she had earned his respect. Afterward, Charles finally led her on a tour of the ranch. He showed her the fields where they grew crops, the large barn where the animals were kept, and the small stream that ran through the property. The land was vast and beautiful, with rolling hills and endless sky. Amelia couldn't help but feel a sense of peace as she took in the scenery. This was the life she had dreamed of, working the land, living close to nature. But even here, with the open sky above her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still an outsider. As the day came to an end, Charles finally turned to her, his expression still unreadable. "You'll get used to the work here," he said quietly. "It's hard, but it's honest. We'll see how you handle it." Amelia nodded, trying to keep her composure. She wanted to prove that she could do this, that she could be more than just a woman with strange eyes. But as she watched Charles walk away, she couldn't help but wonder if he would ever truly see her for who she was. Amelia had always felt different. Growing up in a small, quiet town surrounded by rolling hills and fields of golden wheat, she never quite fit in with the other children. While the other kids laughed and played in groups, she found herself alone, walking the dirt roads or sitting under the shade of an old oak tree. It wasn't that she didn't want to be part of their games, but there was something about her that made the others shy away. The townspeople were friendly enough, but there was a strange, unspoken distance they kept from her. It wasn't just her quiet nature or her love for solitary walks that made them keep their distance. It was her eyes. They were different, unlike anything anyone had seen before. They were large, wide, and piercing. Her gaze seemed to hold a certain mystery, something ancient and intense, almost like they could see deep into your soul. Her eyes were often compared to the sharp amber eyes of a wild cat, beautiful but unsettling. Some even called them cat eyes. As Amelia grew older, she learned to keep her head down and her eyes averted, not wanting to draw attention to herself. Her eyes, the very thing that made her unique, had become a source of shame. The few boys who had shown any interest in her quickly backed off when they saw the depth in her gaze, as if they were afraid to look too deeply into her soul. It left her feeling rejected and lonely. She had always wondered if things would have been different if her eyes had been like everyone else's, if they had been soft and warm, like the eyes of the other girls in town. At the age of 22, Amelia was still living with her parents, helping her mother with the household chores and occasionally working at the local bakery. She loved baking, but she had always felt there was more to life than the small town she had been born into. The world seemed so much bigger, with endless possibilities she had yet to explore. She had heard stories from travelers passing through about the great cities, the mountains far away, and the people who lived in places where nobody cared about the color of your eyes. One day, while cleaning out the attic, Amelia stumbled across an old yellowing newspaper. The headline caught her eye: "Mail-order brides wanted for the New West." The advertisement, buried deep in the pages, was a call for women willing to travel to the rugged frontier to marry men, seeking a new start. The thought of leaving her small town and finding someone who might accept her for who she was filled her with a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. She had nothing to lose. She could finally escape the whispers behind her back and the stares that made her feel like an outsider. Perhaps in a new place her eyes wouldn't make her different. Perhaps someone would love her for who she truly was, not for how she looked. That night, Amelia couldn't sleep. She lay awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her heart racing with anticipation. She knew the journey would be long, and she didn't even know if the men who had placed the ad would accept her. But what if? What if there was someone out there who could see past her eyes and appreciate her for the woman she was? It was a chance, a big one, but it was a chance nonetheless. The very next morning, after much thought and hesitation, Amelia gathered up her courage and wrote a letter. She told the man who had placed the advertisement everything about herself. She didn't hide anything. She wrote about her love of baking, her quiet nature, and the dreams she had of finding someone who would love her for who she truly was. She didn't mention her eyes, though. She didn't need to. She hoped that if he could see the sincerity in her words, he would look beyond her appearance. A few days later, Amelia received a reply. The letter was short but kind. The man, Charles, wrote that he had seen many women come through the town looking for husbands, but he had not yet found one who shared his love for the wilderness and the quiet life he led. He mentioned that he had a ranch in a remote part of the frontier, and that he was looking for a woman who could handle the isolation and hard work that came with living in such a place. The letter didn't mention anything about her appearance, and for a moment Amelia wondered if this might be her chance. Maybe, just maybe, this man could see past her eyes. Her heart raced with excitement, but there was a nagging fear in the back of her mind. What if he only accepted her because he felt sorry for her? What if he too would reject her once he saw her eyes? Amelia pushed the thoughts aside. She had nothing left to lose. She could leave everything behind, start over, and live a life of her own making. The next few weeks were filled with preparations. Amelia packed the few belongings she could carry, some clothes, her mother's quilt, and a small book of poems she had written over the years. She said goodbye to her family, though her mother's teary eyes made her heart ache. Her father didn't say much, but his quiet approval gave her the strength to go through with her decision. She kissed them both goodbye, promising to write as often as she could. Amelia's journey to the frontier was long and difficult. She traveled by train, the clattering wheels and the sound of the whistle filling the silence of her thoughts. She thought about what her life would be like once she reached Charles's ranch. Would she be able to handle the isolation? Would she be able to make a life for herself in the wilderness? She didn't know, but for the first time in years she felt a sense of purpose. She was going to take control of her destiny no matter what. The train ride took several days, and as the landscape changed from flat plains to rugged hills, Amelia could feel the excitement building inside her. She was getting closer to something new, something that could change her life forever. When she finally reached the small town near Charles's ranch, she was nervous but hopeful. The town was smaller than she had imagined, with dusty streets and wooden buildings. It was nothing like the bustling cities she had dreamed about, but it felt different in a way that stirred something in her. She was finally here. She was met by a man who worked for Charles, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Samuel. He was kind and spoke to her gently as he led her to the ranch. It was a long, quiet walk, and Amelia couldn't help but notice how beautiful the land was. The ranch sat at the edge of a vast, untamed forest, and Amelia could feel the power of the wilderness all around her. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Charles was waiting outside. He was a tall man, rugged and strong, with a weathered face and dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His gaze swept over Amelia, and for a moment she felt a pang of insecurity. She wondered what he saw in her. Would he be repulsed by her strange eyes, or would he accept her? Her heart pounded in her chest. Charles greeted her with a firm handshake, and his grip was strong. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I'm glad you made it. We can talk more inside." As they entered the house, Charles led Amelia to a small, rustic sitting room. He seemed polite enough, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made Amelia feel uneasy. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something told her that her journey might not turn out the way she had hoped.